and welcome to today's panel discussion on G7 Turns East. As we see that global governance forums like the G7 navigate shifting geopolitical dynamics, particularly with increasing engagement in the Indo-Pacific and South Asia, the role of youth, digital transformation, and shared global challenges have become more relevant than ever. We're joined today by a brilliant panel of speakers representing youth leadership, policy research, and strategic affairs. We are privileged to have with us Mr. Augusto Gonzalez, President of Young European Leadership, whose work reflects a deep commitment to empowering youth in international policy arenas. We are honored to welcome Ms. Sharon Giacomelli, junior researcher at Mondo Internazionale, whose research continues to shape insightful dialogues on global governance and cultural diplomacy. We're delighted to be joined by Mr. Moritz Flössler, Deputy Director and co-founder of the Young Security Conference, a leading voice in bridging youth and security policy across Europe. Now, without further ado, let us begin with today's discussion. Before proceeding with the Q&A, I would like to open the floor for a round of opening remarks by all the speakers on today's theme. We can start with Mr. Augusto.
Thank you all, and I'm very happy and excited to be here to be able to talk about this very important panel and about how the G7 is beginning to cooperate more with our Eastern partners. So I'm very happy to be here and look forward to a fantastic discussion. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you for those insights. Now, Ms. Sharon, please share your opening remarks.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for inviting me. And I'm really looking forward to this meeting because I hope that we can discuss about this theme, which is very, very important. And it is cooperation between G7 states and, for my part, Europe. It is very crucial for the governance and the international system, and the G7 is one very important forum for the international system, international governance. So I'm very excited to be here.
Same here. We're so glad to have you here, and we can't wait for the discussion to unfold. Now we can pass the floor to Mr. Moritz for his remarks.
And that was the first mistake. I was still muted. Thank you very much, Anshika. And thank you very much for the GEOSTRATA team for having me again. I'm always very delighted to be with you guys, discuss India's role in the world, discuss India-Europe relations and the challenges ahead. And I think that the topic of today is very timely. It's very important to discuss. And I'm looking forward to a great discussion. Yeah, let's get going.
Surely, thank you for that. And I think these opening remarks actually sets the tone for the conversation to follow. Now we can proceed with the Q&A session. My first question will be directed to Mr. Augusto. Now, given that the G7 role as a norm entrepreneur in global governance, how can young policy professionals in Europe shape this discourse around transparency, responsibility, and even ethics in decision-making?
Thank you very much. This is actually something that I do quite a lot in my work at the Young European Leadership. As you know, we are the organization that represents the European Union in the youth engagement groups of the G7, and we often collaborate with our partners across Europe, but also in Canada, the US, and Japan on actually formulating some of the policies that are then recommended to the heads of state. So we, as I mentioned, collaborate actively with other organizations that represent their own countries, Open Diplomacy in France, Young Ambassador Society in Italy, DNK in Germany. And it's essentially our job to collaborate together to give young European people a voice and to be able to voice the concerns that they have to our leaders about not just their domestic affairs, but also our foreign affairs and the way that they believe the world should be run. In general, young people tend to have a, shall we say, more positive outlook on things and how they should be. Things around, as you mentioned, ethics, about what we expect from our leaders from across the world. So we're always very happy to as you know, as the saying goes, to hold their hands to the fire and say that this is what we would like for you to pass into law. This is what we would like the world to look like in the coming 10 to 20 years. We have been successful in that regard, in that we have been able to get several of our priorities from the Y7 communique into the G7 communique. One of the notable policy proposals that we were able to get into the G7 communique this year revolves around research and development on nuclear fusion technology, so that Europe can be a leader in the future of energy and considering nuclear research as part of the energy transition in Europe. So we really do view ourselves as a platform to do just this, to collaborate with institutions, but to also provide a valuable youth perspective that might not otherwise be listened to. So for all those interested, if you are an EU citizen, I'd encourage you to apply through us if you're interested in helping to make Europe and the world a better place.
Thank you for that. I think that was really insightful and also a powerful take on youth engagement and cooperation. Now, building on to that, my next question is directed to Ms. Sharon. Now, keeping the G7-led global frameworks as our context, how can India and Europe cooperation evolve beyond just transactional diplomacy, but also to establish shared leadership on global public goods, such as you have health, digital ethics, and even sustainable finance?
So I think that the India-Europe cooperation is fundamental, given the importance of both actors in the international landscape. So in fact, we can say that Europe is one of the main biggest economic blocs, and it is very important for the global governance. At the same time, India is one of the most populated countries in the world and is a crucial developing state. So I think it is very important for them to cooperate. Moving beyond transactional diplomacy, I think that they should establish shared leadership by framing common strategic narrative based on shared values like the democracy, multilateralism, pluralism, and rule-based global order. So I would like to say just a few words about the three sectors that you were mentioning in the question. So as far as the health field is concerned, I think that they should cooperate to fortifying already existing institutions, especially the World Health Organization, to improve global health security and preparedness for future health-related events, like the one we saw in 2020 with the COVID-19. But at the same time, they think they should work together to diversify supply chains, especially for essential medicines and medical equipment, leveraging India's role as one of the main pharmaceutical producers. In fact, I think it is very difficult to talk about health at the global level without considering and talking to India, since it is the largest producer and exporter of generic medicines, and it is one of the main exporters of vaccines, especially in Africa, as we saw during the pandemics. And for that, I think that the EU especially recognizes the importance of India, should cooperate more. And for that, they create the EU-India Trade and Technology Council, which was launched in 2023. And it is a very important platform for them to talk about trade, diplomacy, digital policy, and green tech. And they had the second meeting in February 2025, when the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen went to visit New Delhi. And in the final joint statement, they reaffirmed the importance of deepening the collaboration in strategic technology, digital governance, and digital connectivity. So this is important for them, and it is very important for the health system. And going on, I think it is about sustainable finance. We can say that mobilizing sustainable finance was one of the key issues of the EU-India Connectivity Partnership, which is another partnership that was launched in 2021. And through sustainable finance, I think they can accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy, which is very important for both states, both actors, and for all the states in the world, since we know that climate change is a very, very important concern. But to conclude very quickly, I think that in order to do that, India and Europe should act together as bridging powers and give voice to the global south within international frameworks like the G7, but not only, like G20, the UN, and so on. And so they should be able to take into consideration different problems and at the same time also possible solutions that are not based on Western countries, Western point of view and perspectives.
Surely, I think you've clearly highlighted how important it is to move from one-off collaborations to more value-based and lasting partnership. And since you talked about technology and digital governance, this leads to my next question for Mr. Moritz. Now we see that given the complexities of cyber warfare, especially at a time wherein we see that artificial intelligence is unregulated by a common global law, how will India and G7 nations' strategic synergy play out to co develop ethical practices for artificial intelligence?
Thank you, Anshika, for that very interesting question, and thank you for my other panelists for opening this already. I do have a little bit of a skeptical outlook on global law. You just mentioned this in the question. It's not the best time for global laws. It's not the best time right now for international law. International law is in a crisis, and I think that yeah, we have to be realistic on this. I think also to make this a little bit more spicy, very few people in our field have a really proper understanding of AI and the capabilities. It's moving so fast, and people who don't have a myself included, by the way, who have a real background in computer science or IT have a really hard time understanding this. Many people talk about this all the time, all day long, having really very little understanding of the developments. I think India is very well placed in general, apart from the whole G7 stuff, to play a huge role here because India just has developed an incredible tech scene. The education in India around everything related to IT, computer science, and other subjects is really amazing over the last years. And at the same time, with everything that comes with AI, India finds itself disproportionately affected. I think there's a huge huge number of young people developing their careers right now. And with everything that will come with AI in all kinds of sectors, India will be very much yeah, affected by it. So this places India generally in a very interesting position here. Now, if it comes to the G7, I personally think I'm also a little bit skeptical if this is the right format. I think if we talk ethical AI or AI regulation on a global scale, it must include China. Otherwise, well, this is just one take that you could take. You could argue, on the other hand, that someone needs to kind of, start. We have to start somewhere, and maybe this format could be a start. But I remain skeptical. I think that the G20 would be a better format. However, the G7 or India in the G7 can still set the tone a little bit in this direction. And I think that what is also lastly very important is to spin the more economic narrative rather than the ethical or human one, because let's face it, let's be overly or hyper realistic here. That will not really gain traction so much than to really make clear what it means in economic terms, what it means to not have any regulation in place. And I think that this would set the world economy in peril. And I think that this needs to be made made clear by countries like India. So phrasing it in a more positive way, showing the advantages, the economic advantages of global AI regulation, that could be a window through which India especially can go. And whether it's doing this then in the G7, which fair enough, let's take a shot, or the G20, or in BRICS, obviously also, or in other formats, is up to India. But I do see a leading role for India.
I think that is an actually very powerful note to start this discussion on. And since we've explored this technical aspect in detail, now let's turn to Mr. Augusto and navigate strategic autonomy and geopolitics a bit. We have seen that as European strategic autonomy has become increasingly salient within transatlantic and even Indo Pacific dialogues, how should youth diplomacy in Europe engage with India's independent foreign policy posture in terms of non alignment and even strategic autonomy, which is gaining prominence recently?
Well, thank you for that. I do really think that's one of the really defining geopolitical questions of our time, especially in Europe. I can tell you that from my point of view, European strategic autonomy is no longer really a want as much as it is a need. The United States has shown itself that it is not the reliable partner that it once was. This was already well known outside of Western societies and how the United States has often treated other countries. But this really is the time that the United States has turned on its core block of geopolitical partners that it has had since the end of the Second World War. This obviously puts Western societies, including Europe, Australia, and others, on, shall we say, a unique footing that has not really been seen since the time that the US became the global hegemon. So I think that this does call for further European integration, as well as European independence across several key economic and defense systems. I think that it is no longer just a conversation that the French government is having between itself and its different, shall we say, internal political interests, but rather it has become a pan-European discussion, especially since the start of the war in Ukraine, as well as the coming back of Donald Trump into the White House. So I personally think that this means that the EU has to act more independently than it ever has before, and it needs to lead its own initiatives. We, for one, have kind of taken up the mantle on the youth politics side. We have begun to work with our partners in South America, especially in Argentina and Brazil, to promote the ratification of the EU-Mercosur Free Trade Agreement. This has been in the negotiating process for over 25 years, since about 1999. And it has essentially taken this long because there's a lot of complexities, but the current geopolitical situation seems to kind of be pushing the deal over the edge. It's also important for the EU to promote its partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. We have taken up the mantle with that on the youth politics level as well. We've begun to increase our partnerships with countries like Indonesia, Australia, South Korea, and Japan, which are very interested now in further cooperation with the European Union at not just the youth, but also at the more strategic, shall we say, head of state level. And to answer your question on how the EU can engage with India, India, as you know, is a country that sees itself as part of the non-aligned movement. Historically, it values its strategic independence across several sectors. I think that that means that the EU and India can collaborate where possible. Things such as trade are areas of excessive cooperation. There's obviously also areas in which Europe and India disagree. I think that Russia is arguably the largest sticking point in the relationship. India has clung on to its ties with Russia, given Russia's support for it in the 1971 war. Yet at the same time, Russia has been a massively declining power in the world ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and frankly, ever more so since the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. We have seen how Russia has wasted essentially a generation of manpower and resources over capturing a few square miles in the Donbass. This is not just a European issue, it is now a global issue. Obviously, now there's a big discussion on India now beginning to import oil and gas from Russia at preferable prices in order to be able to cut back on essentially what it pays for energy to make its economy more competitive. Some obviously are not in favor of that. That's currently, as you know, an evolving political discussion between the White House, Brussels, and New Delhi. So I won't get into it too much, given that it might be out of date by the time that people listen to this. But it does show that while there are some points of tension, there are domains that can be collaborative, trade, technological partnerships. I think that there are natural avenues for alliance making in this part of the world between the EU and India, especially on the geopolitical level as the world begins to become much more multipolar. Give you a quick example, though, of a region that does tend to not really fall under a lot of media scrutiny that could be interesting to analyze between the EU and India is actually clearly Russia's decline of power in Central Asia. As Russia has begun to use up a bunch of its resources in Ukraine, its power in Central Asia has softened, which means that China has begun to fill the power vacuum in the region. This is not something that India wants, given the amount of resources that it has spent over the last couple of decades working to build relations with Iran, as well as to build a port in Iran to have access to Central Asia, circumventing Pakistan and Afghanistan. But it is inevitably something that is going to happen. The more that Russia declines, the more influence that China will have in the region. The EU has begun to step in now that the war in the Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan is over. There is more deal making in the region to try to bring Central Asian oil and gas into Europe to dilute Russia's market access into the European Union. This is probably an area where the EU and India can collaborate. And I think it really does go to show that India would also be, well advised to potentially begin to reconsider its partnership with the Kremlin and Russia. India does see itself as a non-aligned state, but India also very clearly has great power ambitions. But it is really impossible to assert yourself in a multipolar world order as a sole actor. This has been shown time and time again across history, especially across the 19th century concert of Europe, where alliances were constantly shifting, but you needed to have a semblance of partners in order to get your policymaking across. As such, I think that as India wishes to assert itself as a great power, it might have to consider slowly beginning to shed its non-aligned identity in order for it to begin aligning with other powers much more strategically, which will bring about, shall we say, a certain change in mindset in New Delhi. But should India wish to be a great power as it claims, I think that it's something that it will inevitably have to confront. And I don't think that attaching yourself to a declining power like Russia is really something that would benefit India's strategic long-term interests.
Thank you for those insights. And I think you touched on something really important that I wish to quote, which is that autonomy is no longer a want, but a need. And let's take a step further and discuss different forms of diplomacy, for which I would like to pass the mic to Ms. Sharon. Now, as Italy and other European G7 members have deepened engagement with India, what role do you think a very nice, as we say, form of diplomacy, which is cultural diplomacy, can play in counterbalancing narratives of dependency that we can see often underlie in North-South relations? So, how can we ensure that these partnerships are perceived as equal and respectful while considering cultural diplomacy?
So I think that this is a very large and important question because, as we know, narratives are as important and sometimes even more important than facts and what you do. So how do you describe what you do is sometimes more important to other people, to how they perceive what you do. So I think that this is a very large question and we could talk about it for like hours. But I just want to underline just a few very quick things that I think are crucial. So just to begin, I want just to make clear and to say what cultural diplomacy is. So what we mean with this expression. So this expression is used to refer to a particular type of soft power. So it is not that related, that close to economy and politics, but it is more linked to the exchange of ideas, information, art, languages, traditions, so everything that is culture related. And I think that cultural diplomacy can be very useful to transform the traditional narrative about North-South relations, because normally these kind of relations are described using the ideas of hierarchy and dependencies, and this is based mainly on historical reasons, of course, and European colonialism. So it is important to change this narrative into a narrative more based on mutual respect and shared leadership, so that we have not hierarchy on the global level, but collaboration, cooperation. So I think that all the members of the G7 have started for decades ago having cultural exchanges between them and other countries. And there are many programs that are have been created to how to say to make easier those exchanges. For example, the EU has a lot of programs. One in particular with India, it is the EU-India Joint Cultural Programs, and supports collaborative initiatives in art, heritage, and education. I think that it is important to invest more in developing people-to-people connection, for example, by encouraging student exchanges, similar to the Erasmus program that we have within the EU. But at the same time, also tourism can be a very important way to stimulate exchanges. And for that, for example, so the EU has created the Cultural Relation Platform, and they make it easier to obtain visa to go to other places. And to conclude, I think that it is very important to focus on common values shared by the G7 countries and other states. For example, democracy, in the case of India, which is a very important, the biggest democracy of the world, but also pluralism, human rights. And this is a way to create a narrative and a framework that goes behind pure economic reasons. So it's easier to accept the kind of partnership and collaborations, since they are not just motivated by the economy and political reasons, but it's also something more felt by people as well. So it is important to change the narrative from one that describes the West that helps the rest to share global responsibilities, and also from norm export to norm co-creation. So this is important also in the context of the G7, which is often criticized because its partnership and programs are often seen as paternalistic, as something imposed and based on Western ideas and perceptions. So it is important that cultural diplomacy is a part of the relationship between G7 and the Global South.
Truly, I think with this, we have explored culture and traditions thoroughly. And culture is something which is extremely crucial to deepen people to people ties. And you also talked about shared values. So, to understand shared values and mutual commitments, I direct my question to Mr. Moritz. We have seen that over the past few decades, there has been an imbalance of interest between the developed and the developing countries on a lot of global issues, such as climate change and even the UN reforms. So, in what ways do you think that G7's intervention, possibly as a mediator, can help bridge this gap of disparity that is visible in the world order?
Well, thank you for that question. I think to be quite honest, the track record of the G7 in terms of mediating in this regard has not been very well, as far as I'm concerned. I think that the G7 has invited leaders from the global South for decades almost now. It has always been part of the agenda, but it never led to any notable reforms where standards that at least that I know of, that would really have shifted anything in this development. The G7 always prides itself as a standards setting body, or hub rather. But I also think that that is sometimes a little bit, too much credit on this part. Let's not kid ourselves. It's very interest driven. It has been very interest driven in the past, by the countries that are traditionally the West, and towards those who are now considered the global South. I think, however, that the G7 has a bridge building capacity, but it has to do has to engage in some really meaningful agenda setting that includes these actors more. I'll get to that in a second, how that can happen. But it needs to be less top-down approaches and more bottom-up. This might sound again like a buzzword, but I think that there's truth to it. It includes co-design of initiatives, of reforms, and for that you have to consistently stay in touch with these other actors and countries of the global South. I think that climate action is a test case for that. The current divide on historical responsibility versus current capability is real. And I think that the G7 must support a just transition framework where climate finance is predictable, accessible, and linked to developmental needs, really. And that can, I think, shift a little bit the tide. I also think that beyond pledges, it's a world champion in pledges, just like the European Union sometimes, which I genuinely love. But it rarely goes beyond the pledges. It needs to go into partnerships. And lastly, to conclude, also on the point that I made before, like, how to engage countries of the global South a little bit more. Well, meaningful reform of the G7. Make the G7 the G8 again and invite India. That's there you go. And then you don't have to always have these interventions, have these invitations. This year I think it's Brazil. Also, and I think, just be a little bit more bold, step up. India is, if it comes to my personal opinion, is as economically valuable for this group as was Russia when it was taken into I think in the late 90s, into the G7. And so there is no reason not to include India also on the part of the sharing values and sharing a fundamentally democratic culture. Include India, and make it the G8 with India as the bridge maker, as the bridge builder, so to speak. And then you have meaningful reform, and you have a country of the so-called global South as part of your group. And I think that would rebuild more trust than any of the other proposed propositions.
Absolutely. I think, as you said, that to understand these diverse capabilities, these diverse capacities, and even to understand these varied responsibilities, meaningful reforms are necessary. And I really like the way you gave the arguments for India's inclusion. I think everyone looks forward to that. Now, we can shift our focus to digital governance per se. My question is for Mr. Augusto. Now, keeping the evolving regulatory landscape as our context, especially concerning digital sovereignty and even AI ethics, what comparison can you draw in India and Europe in terms of dialogues? And how do you think that young scholars can operationalize this in multilateral platforms like G7, G20, or even the UN?
So thank you for that. I'll preface it by saying that I'm not an AI or digitalization expert. I tend to focus more on security or geopolitical matters. And I think, as Moritz said perfectly in his first response, this technology is also moving so fast that really any answer even that an expert might give you might be outdated 2 weeks from now. So since I don't have a tech background, I'll try to answer this to the best of my ability, given what I know and what I've had to collaborate on in the last couple of years. I think that in some points, the EU and India do share, shall we say, similar philosophies when it comes to digital sovereignty and the importance of data protection. I think this kind of goes contrary sometimes to the American perception that digital data should just kind of flow very conveniently into their coffers as a way to be able to monetize it and continue to grow their tech giants. In this regard, the EU has passed several acts to begin to regulate corporations in this regard, such as the GDPR, the AI Act, etc. And these regulations, at least in my experience when negotiating at the Y7 and the Y20, they tend to be the gold standard for regulations that people who work in these tracks and who make a living off of the knowing about these platforms, that they really value the EU insights on regulation for digital services as well as AI. Even if they don't necessarily want to name them by name, because that would imply giving credit to the European Union, but credit where credit is due, these are seen as the gold standard. And I think India has also made several moves on the digital sovereignty front. It's encouraged companies to place their server capacity in India as a way of ensuring that Indian data regulations would apply. India also famously banned TikTok a couple of years ago as a way of protecting, from its perspective, its own digital sovereignty. Something that, as you know, the United States was also considering, though that decision continues, from my understanding, to be postponed into the future. I think India also does have a leg up in the coming technological race. India has obviously developed an extensive educational and brain base in its country over the last couple of decades when it comes to technology, when it comes to digital innovation. India is the second largest exporter of software and, frankly, the largest exporter of brains to Silicon Valley in the United States. Some of the largest tech companies in America are run by either Indian immigrants or people of Indian descent who are obviously very qualified at what they do. So India very much has a leg up in this technological race that will come up. I think that part of it will be that as the world moves more into a multipolar order, as we saw in previous centuries, as opposed to the unipolar liberal order of the United States, we will begin to even see technology potentially move also in that mercantilist direction. I know there are some people that continue to say that technology is still the one binding, shall we say, liberal institution that continues to span the globe, but we are beginning to see how even that's beginning to crack with legislation beginning to, shall we say, force companies to onshore data servers to keep consumer data or citizen data onshore. Even the European Union considering breaking its contracts with Microsoft to look for domestic European alternatives for its software solutions. So we begin to see that that is also continuing to crack. Obviously, it's a crisis from the perspective of the current hegemon, as well as the current companies that have locked down these markets. But as they always say, crisis is always, a great opportunity for some, especially those that have a chance to potentially catch up. In this regard, India and the European Union have traditionally lagged behind the big conglomerates in, say, the United States and China. So potentially a more fragmenting geopolitical ecosystem could create, shall we say, local champions as well as domestic markets that will be protected for them, even if foreign markets are harder to come by as time goes on. And should India and the EU continue to collaborate together, should they be able to come to good faith philosophical principles on data protection, on AI regulation, on how the internet should work, I think that there is potential for future collaboration as well as potential company building, funding, etc., that could geopolitically benefit both sides.
Truly, I think this has highlighted a lot of important points. Firstly, that how ethics in this AI driven world is critical to protect digital sovereignty, and also how all of us can observe and see that the world is developing its own digital public infrastructure. So, considering all of that, ethics, transparency, and accountability holds much relevance. Now, let's pivot to something equally important. And for that, Ms. Sharon, we've seen that with civil society and youth actors, they're increasingly getting involved in shaping foreign policy discourse. How do you think institutions like Mondo International and even GEOSTRATA can contribute to building long term epistemic partnerships between Indian and European youth in terms of central issues that are in G7 agendas?
So I think that institutions like Mondo Internazionale, GEOSTRATA, and other youth-led organizations that focus on international relations, geopolitics, human rights, and so on, are in the perfect position to build long-term partnerships between India and Europe youth, but also with other countries. This is because I think that usually young people share common concerns, for example, for climate change, social justice, economic opportunity, the uncertainty about the future. And this is not something that it goes beyond national borders, and it is everyone, every young people in the world have common concerns in this field. So this common experience can help the dialogue and the collaboration between groups that live in different states, and talking and discussing with people with different tradition, with different perceptions, can not only break down stereotypes and prejudices, which is a good thing on its own, but I think it can also facilitate the development of new perceptions, on new perspectives and solutions that are not linked to historical events, historical experience, that can be more innovative and that can challenge the existing status quo. So I think that considering all those elements, this kind of cooperation can facilitate the reframing of narrative that we were talking about earlier, that is the narrative about the relation between the North and the South. And I think at the same time that since most of these institutions, organizations use a digital first approach, that means that they use a lot of technologies and so on instead of face-to-face conversation. I think that connected people is way easier, and it is also possible to reach marginalized communities. But creating this kind of cooperation and collaboration, it is a good thing. This is important on its own, but it is also important to, in a way, try to institutionalize these cooperations. That means, for example, that it is necessary to talk and dialogue with official G7 youth groups like the Youth 7, and it is way it can be important in an important way to give new perspectives, new ideas, which are not related only on the geographical areas, which means Western areas, developed countries, but at the same time from a different from young people, which normally are more creative, optimistic about the future. So I think that this is an important role from this kind of organization and institutions.
That is definitely so enlightening. And I think platforms like yours and ours are working towards empowering and having meaningful youth collaboration across borders that feed into real policy influence and not just developing theoretical frameworks. Now, to conclude this discussion, I have a broader question for Mr. Moritz. What is your assessment of youth's involvement as a norm entrepreneur, with which we started our discussion, in order to accelerate global engagements in domains like technology, climate, and even policy making? And how do you think the digital public infrastructure of India and even G7 can fit in this particular global agenda?
Well, also a very good question. I have addressed this question. I addressed this question, I think, when we were when I was at my last event with GEOSTRATA in Delhi. I think that young people always give always a fresh perspective of challenges. They have a different understanding of certain challenges. Sometimes these challenges affect young people more. And through that, they have a different outlook on things. They tend to also be, I think we've heard this before from Augusto, they tend to have a little bit more of an optimistic outlook. And I think that hence creativity they are more creative, and we can all kind of gather from that creativity. I think that with these fresh with these fresh narratives and fresh ideas, young networks like the GEOSTRATA, like the Young European Leadership Initiative, like the Young Security Conference, my organization, it can also kind of serve as a norm laboratory. Things can be checked out on a smaller scale, and ideas can be, can be developed in a way more agile and fresh environment, and then kind of, being brought to the big stage. The big stage, or the main stage, those who are really the decision makers, they always have to give the chance to young people to hear them, to include them. And that includes formats like the G7, which I understand is being then done through initiatives like the Young European Leadership, Augusto's organization. But I mean, I think that there is a little bit more space here to include certain ideas, to really come up with a structure maybe of how to include young voices in these debates. If it comes to the part of your question with the DPI, for example, the digital public infrastructure in India, and then also G7, I think this is a whole new kind of topic. Just to touch on it very briefly, I do think that the DPI is a very open and interoperable and very inclusive ecosystem, but it kind of fundamentally at some points challenges the ideas that we had here over in Europe, whereby our digital policies are very much rights-based, meaning mostly data privacy laws, the GDPR, data protection, stuff like that. And so it doesn't work the same way. But especially in bridging these differences, I think that particularly young people, young voices, and particularly young voices from India with this background, many of young Indians with this background in IT, in computer science, in tech, in AI, more and more, that they can really then again serve, as we've heard it a couple times today, as a bridge builder, and really bring a little bit more of that passion to this whole debate, and then see how we can further develop a common digital policy that serves both of our societies.
Absolutely. I think this also brings us to the idea that youth-based collaboration and meaningful conversation actually work for driving change and have passion involved with it. So, what can be better than ending this conversation with this long-term and futuristic plan? Thank you to all of you for your thoughtful insights. I think in today's discussion, we have emphasized the transformative role of youth. We have discussed about the importance of ethical and inclusive governance. We have also understood the evolving nature of partnerships between India and Europe. So let's just continue to create spaces where young voices can shape global norms and not just respond to them. So thank you for your time. And I think with this discussion, we can bring in a futuristic plan and can start conversations about this extremely important theme wherein G7 turns east. Thank you to our audience as well for joining in. Stay engaged. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our pleasure.